Welcome to Invasion of the Communist Bodysnatchers. Our presenters this evening are Nick Rowell and Michael Pebworth.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Viewpoint presentation. I'm Denise Ward. I'm with the Friends of the Aptos Library. We started this program called Our Community Reads about 5 years ago now. And what we had intended to do is to provide the community with a means to delve deep into the themes of a selected book and to hopefully bring people together around these events that we planned around these themes. And this year's book is Red Letter Days by Sarah Jane Stratford. So I hope some of you have read it, and if you haven't, I hope you'll pick up a copy. It's really a very, very great piece of historical fiction. So before we get to the presentation, I just wanted to mention the next event, which is being sponsored by the La Selva Beach Library Friends. They're going to be showing the film Trumbo at the community church in La Selva Beach this coming Thursday evening, beginning at 7 o'clock. There's going to be an introduction by the historian Robert Strayer. He's participated in OCR before, and he'll, I think, answer some questions and things. So you can register through the Friends of the Aptos Library website. So for tonight's presentation, we're very happy to have Nick Rowell returning as a second-time presenter for OCR. Nick earned his PhD in political science at the University of New Mexico in 2012. He's taught U.S. government comparative politics and international relations at Cabrillo since 2014. His research background focuses on the comparative analysis of Latin American politics, especially interactions between civil society and the state. His teaching emphasizes the robust civic engagement required to sustain the health of democracies. Very interesting. Michael Pebworth has a doctorate in history from the University of Oregon and teaches 20th century US and world history at Cabrillo College. His courses emphasize how popular culture illustrates and provokes change over time. He's the chair of the Global Studies Department, and he's a lifelong comic book nerd. And I just learned he has an incredible vinyl collection. Thank you both for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Denise, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Michael, for joining me this evening, for doing this together. We had a little conversation before we got started and decided that I'll get us rolling this evening, and I'm going to talk for about 20, maybe 25 minutes at the most, and then I'm going to hand it off to Michael, and he'll take it from there. So in just a moment, I'm going to get rolling by sharing my screen. I've got some sort of slides to help me stay organized and some images I want to show you over the course of my talk this evening. But by way of introduction, before I get there, I wanted to share with you that I've been teaching in college classroom for going on about 14 years now. And most of the material that I'm going to share with you this evening is material that I have taught from the very beginning, from like year one of teaching. And there was a time in my career where to get students prepared for this lecture, I had to do a lot of heavy lifting, convincing them that the topics of insurrection, the topics of the incitement of violence against the US government, the topics of the incredibly high stakes of Supreme Court nominations were important enough for them to spend time with me considering. And regardless of how likely they seemed like they might happen in your lifetime, that we should take them seriously, that we should devote some real attention to them in the classroom. I can tell you that I long for the days when I had to put so much work into convincing my students of the relevance of the topic I'm going to be talking about tonight. I wish I could go back to those days, but alas, I can't. And so here we are, and those are some of the major themes I'll be sort of talking about tonight as I cover the role that the Supreme Court played in the Red Scare, both facilitating some aspects of it and then pushing back later against it as well. So I'm going to share my screen, and if it works properly, we will get started. So the story of the Supreme Court's involvement in the Red Scare is actually a story that begins with a piece of federal legislation called the Smith Act. And the Smith Act is something that came out of its time and its place. It was an act of Congress passed in the midst of, in the global situation of rising communist and fascist ideology that seemed at the time to be posing a very real and legitimate threat to the liberal, democratic, capitalist world that the United States was vested in building. So it's in that sense that it made sense from the perspective of Congress to, in 1940, pass this piece of legislation called the Smith Act. And this piece of legislation did a lot of stuff. But what's most important for my talk this evening is that this law, once it went into effect, made it a crime to, and now I'm going to quote the actual legislation itself, made it a crime to knowingly or willfully advocate, abet, advise, or teach the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing the government of the United States by force or violence. Now, it's probably an understatement to observe that that passage alone, in a long and complicated bill, encompasses quite a bit. And as the story sort of plays out, the Smith Act, and particularly this verbiage that I've shared with you on the screen, is what was used by the United States government to systematically indict communist political activists from its inception in 1940 until some events we'll be covering a little bit later in 1957. So what I'm going to do is talk about two different Supreme Court cases that bookend the era of the Red Scare and reveal how much the Supreme Court can change during short periods of time and how that interacted with the defendants at the center of each case. And the first of those cases is a case that involves this guy you see on your screen. His name is Eugene Dennis. This is his mugshot. And seated around him on the right-hand side of your screen are his, in the words of the US government, his co-conspirators. Eugene Dennis was a major figure in the effort in the late 1940s and early 50s to organize and try to revitalize Communist Party USA, right? The Communist Party as it existed in the United States. Now, during this time, the Communist Party in the United States didn't hold the incitement of revolution as a goal to be actively pursued by their organization. In other words, they might advocate for the overthrow of the United States government, but they were doing so at this time in their organization's history as a matter of principle and as a matter of doctrine, not as a matter of conspiring to carry out insurrection in the form of action. So rather, what the Communist Party focused on during this time in its history was to try to do the hard work of creating broader acceptance of socialism among the US public. So what that meant is that most of its work involved things like planning the creation of written work, like periodicals or pamphlets that would try to teach communist ideas, or establish small schools of indoctrination for people who are interested in joining the party and joining the cause. But what they were not doing is sitting around a table plotting the revolution that they hoped might one day arrive, if not in their lifetime, maybe within the next century. But that was sort of the mindset of the leaders of the Communist Party during this era, including Eugene Dennis. Well, it will probably come then as no surprise that Dennis is arrested, charged, and convicted of violating the Smith Act. The Smith Act is used to try to bring him to heel. His conviction comes in 1948, and he's actually convicted along with 10 other co-defendants. And after his conviction, Dennis did precisely what you would expect him to do. He began the process of working through a legal appeal. And the argument he was making in his appeal with his attorneys and with his co-defendants was that the Smith Act, in the way that it was used against him for his conviction, was actually a violation of his free speech rights. And so what this then began is a multi-year legal battle that will culminate in a Supreme Court case called Dennis versus the United States in 1951. But the legal dilemma that his case posed is a really fascinating one, and it's one with a legacy that persists even into the present. And in the late 40s and early 1950s, the way this legal dilemma took shape at the heart of his case was this. Since 1919, the phrase, quote, clear and present danger was used by the United States Supreme Court to adjudicate what types of speech were not protected by the First Amendment. In other words, the Supreme Court was allowing government to create laws that restricted freedom of speech in circumstances where that speech could be shown to pose a clear and present danger. But there's a big problem with that phrase used in this way. And it's that clear and present danger is a pretty broad statement. It's pretty vague. And in establishing this clear and present danger test, the Supreme Court never established a fixed standard by which to determine when a danger is, quote, clear, or how remote a danger may be and yet still be called, quote, present. In other words, each time a case like Dennis's came before a federal court, it was treated on a case-by-case basis, where on the basis of evidence and the law in question, the court itself would have to assess whether or not a clear and present danger had been present. And so more to the point in the case of Dennis and his lawsuit, what was unclear, even when using the clear and present danger test, was when does a conspiracy become a present danger? At what point does trying to create and publish the Daily Worker pose any kind of present danger to the United States government? So on his route to the Supreme Court during his appeals process, Dennis and his co-defendants' first stop was actually the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. That court will rule against Dennis. They don't buy his argument that his freedom of speech has been unfairly limited. And the judge in this case, who writes the opinion, who writes the ruling explaining how the court came to this conclusion, tries to do some of the work of bridging the gap between clear and present danger and what it was that Dennis had been up to with his co-defendants. And that judge, incidentally, that judge's real name was Learned Hand. And Learned Hand, despite the unusual name, actually would go on to be a pretty well-renowned civil liberties advocate, even though in these circumstances, right at the height of the Red Scare, he doesn't side with the plaintiff. So in his explanation of why it is that he doesn't buy Dennis's argument, Judge Learned Hand writes, in each case, right, each clear and present danger case that comes before a federal court, the government must ask whether the gravity of the evil, discounted by its improbability, justifies such invasion of free speech as is necessary to avoid the danger. In other words, the argument he makes is that if the evil in question, like the bad thing, the danger is bad enough, then it doesn't matter really how probable it is that that evil will come about as a result of this person's speech. It's like a sort of trade-off situation. The more evil the possible outcome, the less the sort of present danger part really matters. And so that becomes his sort of reasoning. And so that then becomes part of the conversation in front of the Supreme Court when being ruled against in the appellate court. Dennis goes on to make his appeal to the Supreme Court. But the US Supreme Court, when they hear Dennis's case, craft a majority opinion that essentially adopts the same reasoning as Judge Learned Hand. And specifically, when the decision is announced publicly in June of 1951, the Supreme Court ruled 6-2 against Dennis. They upheld his conviction. And the majority opinion actually borrowed language from the appellate court justice. The majority opinion reasoned that advocating communist ideas, regardless of context, posed a clear and present danger due to the, quote, gravity of evil inherent in such a conspiracy. And so therefore, such speech could be limited by government without infringing First Amendment rights. But something interesting happens here, and this is one of my favorite parts of the complexities of the Supreme Court and the US political system at large. And it's that, of course, the Supreme Court justices don't all have to agree with each other. And each Supreme Court justice who disagrees with the majority opinion has the opportunity to craft a dissenting opinion in which they explain why they disagree with the ruling that the court has just made. And Dennis's case prompts two different dissenting opinions from two justices. The magic of dissenting opinions is that today's dissenting opinion, if can become tomorrow's majority opinion if the people on the court change, right? As justices come and go from the court, what used to be a dissenting opinion, a minority opinion, in effect, can change and become a majority opinion, and the Supreme Court has full authority to revisit issues that it has already covered in previous rulings. So the two justices who dissent in Dennis's case are Justice William Douglas, who argues that Dennis and his co-defendants were being prosecuted for teaching and advocating from books that were not themselves banned. And he concluded that the government was punishing the communists for their beliefs rather than their advocacy. And then the other dissenting opinion came from Justice Hugo L. Black. And he argued that Dennis and his co-defendants were not charged with an attempt to overthrow the government or any overt acts designed to overthrow the government. They were not even charged with saying anything or writing anything designed to overthrow the government. The charge was that they agreed to assemble and to talk and publish certain ideas at a later date. And so, borrowing the precise phrase from Black's dissenting opinion, he says, no matter how it is worded, this is a virulent form of prior censorship of speech and press, which I believe the First Amendment forbids. But the case is settled. Dennis is ruled against, and Dennis serves 5 years in federal prison. Now, that decision has major consequences outside of just the legal arena, because the Dennis decision essentially gave a green light to anti-communist crusaders across the American political system. The House Un-American Activities Committee was already blacklisting, it was already helping to build and perpetuate the blacklist at full speed in 1951 when this case came out. But McCarthyism would continue to accelerate starting in the early 1950s all the way through 1954. So this kind of kicks off that kind of that most intense period of the Red Scare. And after the ruling, the Justice Department proceeded with 15 new prosecutions of 129 communists in the United States, 96 of whom were convicted. Now, among those convicted is the person at the center of the second case. And that woman is Oleta O'Connor Yates. Yates, too, had been a member of the Communist Party in California, but she'd been more of like a second-tier leader. And her role involved doing things like running for local level office and teaching classes at the party's indoctrination school. She, too, taught, communist ideology, right? Marxism, Leninism. But she, too, wasn't plotting the revolution herself. And Yates, in 1951, in the aftermath of the Dennis ruling, her and 13 other co-defendants were indicted for conspiracy to violate the Smith Act, just like Dennis had been. And just like Dennis, Yates appeals, arguing that this use of the Smith Act infringes on her free speech rights. But by the time the case reached the US Supreme Court in 1956, things had changed dramatically. McCarthy had lost his chair of the Senate Investigations Committee. Republicans no longer held a majority in the Senate. And the Red Scare was starting to cool, right? The Senate had already passed resolutions denouncing McCarthy. And in the Supreme Court specifically, 4 of the justices who helped decide Dennis versus the United States were no longer on the court in 1956. But the 2 dissenters from Dennis, Douglas and Black, remained on the court. They were still on the court. And so when Yates's case makes it to the Supreme Court, not only have those changes taken place, but those changes have facilitated the beginning of the War in Court, which runs from 1953 to 1969, which is a watershed moment in American jurisprudence, a period of the Supreme Court's history that dramatically expanded civil rights, expanded fair trial and due process rights, and in the case we're talking about tonight, expanded civil liberties, including freedom of speech. So the War in Court takes up essentially the same case, but with a new defendant. But this time, the Supreme Court rules 6-1 in favor of Yates. And they produce a new ruling. They produce a new explanation for why it is the case that they no longer think somebody in a situation like Yates meets that clear and present danger test. And they explain that there is a distinction between the teaching of abstract ideas, or what the court calls, quote, advocacy of doctrine, because that's protected. That doesn't pose a clear and present danger. But on the other hand, speech intended to incite the overthrow of the government, or what the court calls advocacy of action, that is not protected by the First Amendment. Yates and her co-defendants fall in that first category, advocacy of doctrine, not advocacy of action. And so her conviction is overturned. Now, this ruling didn't go so far as to strike down all of the Smith Act, but what it did was effectively gut the way that the Smith Act had been used for the previous 17 years to achieve successful prosecution of communists. And so after this decision in 1957, prosecution of communist political activists using the Smith Act effectively ended. Now, it would be tempting to sort of wrap up the story here and sort of pretend like this is the big happy ending where we achieve some better version of democracy. And while I want that to be true, this wasn't the end of a story to the people who were living it. It felt like the beginning of something new and maybe even scary. And in fact, it was an extremely controversial decision. Several attempts were made almost immediately in Congress to pass new legislation that would limit the Supreme Court's jurisdiction to consider cases like this in the future. Now, all of those efforts failed, but there were many. J. Edgar Hoover publicly described this decision as a victory for the United States Communist Party. And Eisenhower, though he was more or less quiet about it in public, was incensed. And historians debate about the precise way in which he articulated how mad he was at Earl Warren, a justice who he had appointed, he had nominated for the Supreme Court. But in the public, Eisenhower kept his distance. Now, I think now is probably a good time for me to sort of wrap up. But if we're interested as a group, when we get to like our Q&A session, there's an interesting legacy of this case that we see in the present. And it's related to, of course, the insurrection on January 6th of 2021, and the extent to which Donald Trump himself was culpable for any of the violence that followed his speech to the crowd that day. But for the sake of time, and because I cannot wait to hear what Michael Pebworth has to say this evening, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to him.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. I just want to quickly point out that the phrase "gravity of evil" would be a fantastic name for a comic book. So thank you for that segue and handoff there. Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Pebworth, history instructor at Cabrillo College, and thank you, Nick. That was awesome. A fantastic example of change over time, man. I'm always down for change over time in any presentation anywhere. What I'm going to present tonight actually overlaps with Nick's talk and just comes at it through another window, and that's through the window of popular culture. And I suppose I should sort of talk about how I do these things in the classroom. Nick mentioned that he kind of has to set up, get students ready to understand the relevancy and importance of the Supreme Court decisions in our world. I start with a much easier, launching pad. I don't really have to inform my students that superheroes, which come from comic books, are kind of a big deal. Like, my students are pretty well versed in that, between the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all the streaming sources. I mean, Disneyland has, California Adventureland has an Avengers campus. I mean, superheroes are kind of the contemporary American mythology, and they're everywhere. The challenge I have as a historian is to historicize those comic book superheroes and use them as a case study for understanding change over time, and looking at a process of a popular culture art form that starts out, totally marginalized, regarded as maybe a couple of steps up from pornography, which then, becomes extremely popular, is wrapped up in the New Deal and World War II, part of the booming consumer economy of the 50s. But then ironically also informs the countercultures of the the hippie counterculture of the 60s, the punk rock counterculture of the 80s and 90s. And to the point at which superhero comics, or the superheroes from comics, then go global. The Marvel superhero movie Black Panther was like a global phenomenon, was extremely popular in Europe and Africa. So we're at a point now in which superheroes from American comic books are like ubiquitous and global. What I want to do tonight is look at that exact same time period that Nick was talking about, 1950 to 1954, which, as Nick said, is, this intense period of government repression of, for the most part, law-abiding dissent. And what I want to show to people tonight is that a small independent comic book publisher called EC, and that's an abbreviation for Entertaining Comics, so EC, Entertaining Comics, but a small independent comic book publisher in the early 1950s was like phenomenally successful, sold more and more comic books, millions of comic books between 1950 and 1954, and that the stories in the comic books made by EC, and EC didn't do superhero comics. EC focused on the genres of horror, suspense, and science fiction, and also war comics. They also made war comics, which are some of the most anti-war comics you could ever possibly read. But again, EC Comics, using these malign genres of horror and science fiction, really consistently for 4 years in a row articulated a critique, a challenge to the consensus of the Red Scare and the Cold War. They didn't quite get away with it, but that experience of making those stories, then getting harassed by the government, that then led to a series of changes that continue to reverberate in American popular culture in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. So that's my spiel for the next 22, 23 minutes. In a moment, this gorgeous face is going to disappear, and instead I've got a lot of images from comic books from the 1930s. And then what I want to do is, after giving you a quick deep dive into the origins of comic books and how they become a foundational part of American popular culture. Their origins are in the 30s. They become extremely popular in the 1940s, and they're just everywhere in the 1950s. I want to give that history. And then I want to point out how this, small independent company challenged it, and I'm going to really kick it old school. I'm going to go back. I'm hoping there's some people here in the audience who know what I'm talking about. Starting in the late 60s and really up to the early 1990s, you could go to the department store and buy these, it was like older comic books that were reprinted, and there was a little 7-inch 45 record that came with the comic book. You take it home and you put the record on and you read the comic book while all the voices are coming out of the stereo. I'm going to do that for everybody tonight. I have an EC comic book story. They're short. They're just a few pages long. I will be playing all the parts in that comic book. But I really, if we're going to talk about comic books, then I got to read you a comic book story, and then we'll pull it all together. I'll tell you what happened after that, and then we will do some Q&A. And you can tell that Nick and I teach together at Cabrillo, serve on a lot of committees together. I can't help but point out that, Nick had a boombox and some nice cubes with records in them. And it just, Nick takes one to know one, man. Look at that back there. All right, everybody. So I'm going to share my screen and show off some cool looking stuff. So, all right, everybody, what you're looking at right here is we're looking at the origins of comic books right now. This is actually a newspaper comic strip called Crazy Cat by a guy named Bernard Harriman. And here's the thing about comic books. I mean, comic books, similar to blue jeans, jazz, deeply ironic Supreme Court decisions, comic books are a uniquely American invention. So when future extraterrestrials unearth our civilization, they're going to be super jazzed to find all of our comic books. The reason I say they're like an American innovation is that all of the ingredients that go into the creation of comic books in the 1930s are American ingredients. So right here we have one of them, newspaper comic strips, which begin in the 1890s. And I'm going to give you a little bit about Pulp Fiction. But yeah, comic books come out of newspaper comic strips from the 1890s, pulp literature, Pulp Fiction from the 1920s, and of course, Hollywood films from this kind of late 20s, early 1930s age of Hollywood. There's also some innovations in printing in the middle of the Great Depression that helped to explain it. But what we're looking at right now, this is a newspaper comic strip, and the way newspaper comic strips worked is, they took up the entire page. That's an entire newspaper page, and newspaper pages used to be way bigger than they are now. If you're trying to read the words, I would say let go of that. Crazy Cat is a truly bizarre newspaper comic strip in which the characters, who a lot of whom are sort of these anthropomorphic, animals running around, speak this truly bizarre blend of like English, Yiddish, and just like phonetic sounds. And there's a lot of running around. But what I want to stress here is we're getting one of the most foundational ingredients to comic books, and that is just, graphic sequential art. So I'm just going to use I just want to point out here, up in the top left, you've got a square and you've got images of a creature in it, and there's words, and then there's another square next to it that shows the creature somewhere else. But using a series of boxes to illustrate movement and actions and reactions, and then having these little word bubbles, these little dialogue bubbles, word balloons is the jargon in the biz, having these word balloons to communicate speech, or sometimes having a box with captions to indicate narration. What you're getting here right now is just the basic language of comic books. I mentioned earlier that kind of the next ingredient comes in the 1920s with pulp literature. Those are, of course, pulp literature are not comic books. They're prose, they're text, they're stories. And those are stories in which, men do a lot of problem solving through violence in exotic locations around the world. And Pulp Fiction had an immediate impact on newspaper comic strips, so much so that you had the development of newspaper comic strips that have a similar action adventure aesthetic. This is Terry and the Pirates, one of the more famous ones. But the birth of comic books really comes in the late 1930s with the creation of Superman. 1938 Action Comics, Superman. My dog is barking in the background. I don't know if you can hear that. He's a huge comic book fan. Basically in the depths of the Depression, one of the largest printing presses in Connecticut, the workers there discovered that the printing plates they used for newspaper size comic pages could be reduced, and that you could print 2 pages side by side on a tabloid page, fold it in half, bind it, you've got a book. And so at first, the newspaper companies took all their old newspaper strips and put those into comic books, and they sold really well. In fact, they sold so well that in just a few years, all the major newspaper syndicates had exhausted their back material, and they had to come up with something new. So Superman is, something that gets published, written by 2 nerdy, lower middle class Jewish American suburban teenagers, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster from Cleveland. This is something this was new content. They had to create something new. And so this is essentially the birth of superhero comic books. It's really kind of assembly line / sweatshop labor. It's a ton of guys and gals packed into a room with just quotas of content that they had to crank out. I do want to point out that it's not a coincidence that superhero comics are invented during the Great Depression. And it's important to notice that the creators of superhero comics are disproportionately, Jewish, Catholic, second immigration, the sons of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, who all aspired to be magazine illustrators or department store graphic designers, and who just found that those doors were simply not open to them. Superman is just an instant sensation. It's really interesting. The early Superman comics, the bad guys are not these supervillains. The bad guys in early Superman comics are essentially bankers, landlords, judges, corrupt factory owners, like basically the bad guys of the Great Depression. And numerous historians have pointed out that in some ways Superman is like a surrogate FDR. He's the guy that stands up for common people and throws cars around, as we can see from this cover here. Oh, my insurance rates. All right. So this is the birth of superhero comics, and they continue to grow and expand. Superhero comics are part of the mobilization for World War II. The American military bought millions of comics that they actually distributed to American GIs on military bases around the world. So you kind of get almost this instant globalization of American popular culture. This is a Captain America comic that's actually from before Pearl Harbor. So this comic, Captain America punching Nazi in the face, is pretty typical for its time. After World War II, comic book sales continued to grow with the booming post-war economy, and comic book companies shifted into all kinds of genres beyond superheroes, Westerns, funny animal comic books, war comics, romance comics, which were, explicitly aimed at, young women. And you'll be shocked when I tell you, typically reinforce kind of heterosexual normative behavior. But, this is a time where World War II had unleashed a lot of changes. Married women went into the workforce. Almost 2 million African Americans moved from the rural South to the urban North and urban West Coast. You had a lot of civil rights activism during World War II, such as the March on Washington movement or the GI Forum, rising union membership. So it's just important to remember that, these are comic books aimed at kids, but what's going on in the adult world is some people are pushing for dramatic changes to the distribution of, economic and political power in the country, but you also have millions of Americans who want to reinforce traditional hierarchies and boundaries. What we have to add into here is the context of the Cold War, the US foreign policy of containment to stop communism at a global level, and a domestic campaign by the federal and state governments to repress dissent and repress law-abiding protest. Nick mentioned the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Senate Investigation Committee, spending many years, and a lot of state legislatures following their example, harassing the labor movement, civil rights movement, Hollywood television and radio producers. A lot of history professors got called in front of Congress. But Walt Disney made comic books. Here's the Donald Duck comic book with his nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. The old Donald Duck comic books are wild. They're like adventure stories. And but here's where I want to get into the EC challenge. So yeah, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And here we've got the Crypt Keeper, the Old Witch, and the Vault Keeper. So, a slightly different trio going on there. But let me give you the numbers. So when this comic book came into existence, Tales from the Crypt, and if you're like, hey, wait a second, wasn't that a really cheesy show on HBO in the 1990s? Yes. But 40 years before that, it's a groundbreaking horror anthology comic book. By 1953, when this comic book was out, there were 70 million comics sold in the United States. It's a $1 billion industry. 90% of US kids under the age of 18 read comic books. 25% of Americans with a high school degree, high school graduates, said they read comic books. And a big chunk of them were, of course, veterans of World War II. So here what I want to talk about is the EC. If you look up here at the top left, you can see the EC logo, an entertaining comic, the EC Comics. The company was started in 1945, and for its first 5 years, you wouldn't know it from looking at this cover, but for its first 5 years, EC Comics put out adaptations of the Bible. The owner died in 1947. He left the business to his son, Bill Gaines. And in 1950, at the age of 25, Bill Gaines decided that what the world needed were comic books. And this is a direct quote from him, comic books for, quote, smarter kids and adults. And the genres that Gaines focused on were not superhero, but instead the genres of horror. Here we see Tales from the Crypt, The Haunt of Fear. Here we've got the Old Witch, the Vault Keeper, and the Crypt Keeper. Again, the Vault of Horror. That's a zombie. Everybody relax. That's a zombie. He can't feel a thing. Science fiction. And I do just have to point out quickly what we have here is an image of Manhattan. That's Manhattan Island. There's Central Park. And we're seeing Manhattan in the aftermath of a nuclear explosion that has created a massive crater that the Hudson River is pouring into. So he canceled the Bible comics, launched several horror and science fiction and war anthology comics. So there's no heroes who reappear in each issue. Every issue has new original stories in it. And let me get back to that in just a second. I'm going to leave it on this image of an obliterated Manhattan. One of the things Gaines insisted was that EC Comics should have a high quality of artwork and that the authors and writers should get credit. That was a new innovation. The comic books of the 30s and 40s, nobody put their names on it whatsoever. Bill Gaines, publisher of EC Comics, paid his writers and artists above the bigger companies. A disproportionate number of the writers and artists who worked for EC were either World War II or Korean War veterans. They also maintained that reflection of being the sons of Eastern and Southern European immigrants. EC sold about 500,000 copies of each title. They usually did from 1950 to 1954. They averaged about 15 different titles that came out bi-monthly, and they had anywhere between $5 and $9 million in sales, which, I mean, if I started a comic book company, I would love to get those numbers. So what I want to do right now is go back to that kind of old analog spirit. And I'm not going to read every single word in every single panel, but we've got a story here from Shocking Suspense Stories from 1952 called The Patriots. The Patriots. So as you can see, our story begins on a beautiful sunny day. People have lined up for a parade. There's flags flying. We got kids running down the street. Everybody's stoked for the parade that's coming. And here we've got some folks in the crowd. This is the biggest turnout the town's ever seen. Those guys deserve it. Korea was no picnic. And here we've got our, invisible narrator who points out that a trim young woman turned to her husband who stood at the curb edge beside her. I'll be back. I'll be back as soon as the parade is over, dear. Oh, why don't you stay, honey? I'm going to do like my total Donna Reed voices right now. Well, the shops will be empty. Everyone will be watching. It's a good opportunity to do some shopping. All right, honey. I'll wait right here until you get back. Well, the young woman left her husband. Excuse me, pardon me. What's the matter, lady? Don't you like parades? A roar goes up from the crowd. Way up the main street, sunlight glinted on something shiny. You got brassy music. Here comes the band. There's a drum major in front. Look at him twirl that baton. But down here, we've got some guys here in the crowd. Listen to them trumpets. Boy, I love big band music. Hey, get a load of that sourpuss. If you don't like parades, what'd he come for? Shh, he'll hear you. Hey, look, a general. Oh, yeah, then at this point, my dog ran through while I was taking pictures. There he is. I'm not making it up. I actually have a dog. And, more soldiers come walking by, our parade watchers say, hey, look, they're carrying guns. Hey, with bayonets. Boy, I'd hate to get one of them in my guts. Hey, look at that character now. Why, I oughta. Take it easy, Charlie. Look how they keep in step. Don't it look nice? Next came another column of soldiers. These carried no guns. Them's the guys that got the Purple Heart. All of them guys were wounded? That's right. What happens to these guys now? I bet they're all getting furloughs. Charlie, he's sneering now. Look at his nose. He must be a foreigner. Yeah, his skin's kind of dark too, and his hair. Up the street, hats were coming off. Bare heads were caressed by the gentle spring breezes. The color guard approached. If you don't like it here, why in blazes don't he go back where he came from? Cut it out. Here comes the flag. The flag rippled. Its crimson and white stripes rolled over and over. The blue field and white stars sparkled in the sunlight. All heads were bare as it passed. All heads but one. Hey, look. Why the dirty? The sneering man on the curb stared at the red, white, and blue, but he made no move to take off his hat. He just stood there sneering as the flag went by. Hey, what do you say, Charlie? I say he must be one of them lousy Reds. Commie, yeah, that's it. He's a commie. We ought to run him out of town. Herbie, where you going? I'm going to get him. Beat it, buddy. I beg your pardon. I said beat it. We don't want guys like you hanging around. Hey, look, go away. This is a free country, and I'll stay here as long as... Free country, you dirty Red. What's wrong with you, you crazy commie? Red? Let me at him. I'll teach him. Go ahead. The filthy communist is all yours. The bass drum down the street beat out a steady tempo as the blackjack rose and fell. Traitor, subversive, red rat. The last column of soldiers marched by, watching out of the corners of their eyes. Looks like a brawl, drunken bums. If they want to fight so much, somebody ought to ship them over where we came from. That'll teach him a lesson in Americanism he'll never forget. Hey, he's out cold. Maybe he's dead. The sound of the music was gone. The bunting hung limp and still. The breeze had died. Freddie, are you in there? Hey, it's his broad. The guy is dead. We killed him. And it serves him right. The dirty... Freddie. Don't waste your tears, lady. He's not worth it, the commie rat. Oh, why'd you do it? He was a dirty red lady, sneering at our boys just coming back from over there and insulting our flag by not taking his hat off. The young woman's body shook as she whimpered. They couldn't tell if she was laughing or crying. He wanted to come down to greet his old outfit. They did the best they could putting his face back together after the shell tore it off. Only when he smiled, it looked like he was sneering. Old outfit? You mean he fought in Korea? Then why didn't he take off his hat when the flag passed, huh? He couldn't? No, he didn't know. He couldn't see it. He was blind. Oh, yeah. So that's the end. And what you got right there is the, American literary tradition of the twist ending, Edgar Allan Poe, O. Henry. And if you're thinking, how did these guys get away with this? Yeah, well, they didn't. There's a best-selling book in 1953 called Seduction of the Innocent by a child psychologist named Dr. Frederick Wortham, which basically said comic books were the source of juvenile delinquency and homosexuality. It's a bestseller. It pretty much said Batman was gay. In 1954, the U.S. Senate, the Senate committee that had been investigating organized crime, headed by Senator Kefauver, he had a buddy, a Republican senator from New Jersey, Hendrickson, he began a Senate subcommittee investigating juvenile delinquency. I'm sorry, Kefauver was investigating organized crime. And Bill Gaines, publisher of EC, receives a subpoena, and he has to testify in front of the Senate committee for 5 hours. And the senators just bulldoze him, constantly accusing him of, peddling smut and pornography to American children. The comic book industry is so afraid of censorship and litigation that they do something similar to the Hays Code of Hollywood in the 1930s. That is, the big comic book companies, not EC, the big comic book companies team up with the distributors to create the Comics Code Authority, which had a whole long list of things that comic books were not allowed to do. And one of them was they were not allowed to show authority figures in a bad light. They were not allowed to show violence unless it was punished. And they couldn't show werewolves, witches, or vampires. And so it was, surgically written to basically drive EC out of business. Bill Gaines said, fine, we don't make comic books anymore. And he canceled all the horror, science fiction, and suspense stories. And instead, he said, we're going to make a magazine. We're going to make a magazine, not a comic book, a magazine that makes fun of everything. So Mad Magazine comes out of the EC horror and science fiction comic books. And then that magazine, with all of its upending of social and cultural and political norms, is, of course, a huge inspiration for the counterculture of the 1960s, which brings us to the Marvel comics of the 1960s. So I'm going to stop. Oh, not a new share. I'm going to stop sharing and get out of there. And here I am. I'm back and I'm out. I'm done. Thank you so much for listening to that. I believe it's now time for Q and the A.
Well, actually, it is. And we have a couple of questions that came in, and then Nick answered them, but I always like to go through them anyway. The first one was Tom Clark, the lone descent in Yates, father of Ramsey Clark, right? Like father, not like son. And Nick said, yes, Clark was the lone descent in Yates. Anything you want to expand on there?
No, other than it's an interesting opportunity to talk about the role of Earl Warren in that court, in that Earl Warren was sort of like a driving force behind that court, in that he believed deeply in this idea that the role of the court was to achieve justice, was to bring about justice, even if that meant doing big, bold things. And he's credited not just with providing that leadership, but doing a really good job of marshaling support behind these major rulings so that they weren't like close split decisions. And so while there's this one lone dissent, it's so noteworthy, especially when you think about the situation in the Supreme Court today, of what it means to have a huge, bold decision that would be so controversial, and yet it be a 6-1 decision as opposed to something closer. And so many people attribute that to Earl Warren's well-honed political skills, which were extensive, right? As a former governor of California, former attorney general in California, and so on.
And then Nick, you also said that we have like 2 minutes, and you said we could follow up about the insurrection and what that means for, Smith Act versus January 6th, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So the kind of connecting line between where we left off the story with Yates and eventually January 6th is that the Supreme Court revisits subversive speech in an effort to try to clarify or hone in on clear and present danger a little bit more effectively. And it probably comes as no surprise, hopefully, that it's the Warren Court that actually does this. The last year of the Warren Court in 1969, the court takes up a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio. And this is a case with a very different sort of set of circumstances. We're not talking about like the far left anymore. We're actually talking about the far right. This Brandenburg, the person at the center of this case, was a member of the Klan in Ohio. But in any event, in taking up that case, what the Supreme Court does is effectively replace clear and present danger as the standard, right, for deciding when we can and can't limit speech. And they replace clear and present danger with the phrase imminent threat. And the implication is that if we're going to limit people's free speech, we should only allow government to do that in situations where their speech poses an imminent threat. Or you could phrase it as a very, very, very clear and very, very, very present danger. So fast forward, right? So that becomes the gold standard of the Supreme Court's interpretation of free speech rights in context of subversive speech. And fast forward to January 6th, and Trump is giving a speech in front of a crowd of people that have been fed a lot of information that is not accurate, and who are really emotional, right? Who are feeling strong emotions, right, while they're at this protest, feeling threat to what they believe is the future of the country. Well, what imminent threat did is it shifted our considerations of like when you can limit free speech to considerations in the context of like a riot, right? Or a potential riot in the offing. Not like a room full of communists sitting around a big table deciding, how best to publish the Daily Worker. Now we sort of focus in on just like what's going on in the moment when a speech is being given. Now, what Trump's defenders will do after January 6th is they will make the case that the second impeachment, right, which was all about the events of January 6th, didn't rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors because President Trump was within his full free speech rights because he was protected by imminent threat. And so I'm certainly not like apologizing for Trump here, right? Like this is an argument his defenders made. But what it did was create this weird moment in American political history where this epic thing happened. We all watched it happen on TV. And then for weeks, there was this back and forth of op-ed columns between like legal scholars informing the American public about imminent threat and what it meant, and whether or not Trump had actually created an imminent threat with his speech that day. And so there's this through line, right, of a moment, in our nation's history, the Red Scare era, where our country was going through a period of intense, like, socio-political stress. And there is this, outgrowth from it, right? Like the Supreme Court starts to rethink how it handles these delicate issues. And here we are today in another moment of profound socio-political stress in our country. And, those are the tools we sort of pick up to try to figure our way through it.
All right. Our next question says, can you both comment on pop culture, like TV shows like Twilight Zone, and how that genre evolved and how did it fit into the Cold War environment?
I'll take a shot at that one. I mean, I think there's some overlap between the Twilight Zone and the EC comic books, a similar anthology setup, right? The Twilight Zone has a regular host, but it doesn't have reoccurring characters. And that's how the EC comics were. And yeah, there's numerous Twilight Zone episodes that were strong criticisms of the nuclear arms race, of Jim Crow segregation, of kind of, groupthink, fascism. So yeah, I would say in a lot of ways, the Twilight Zone is on that continuum of the way in which science fiction and horror and thriller genres, because they're regarded as just junk by, they're not regarded as high art. So in some ways, I think Twilight Zone also is starting as the Red Scare is beginning, it's past its peak. But no, I would put the Twilight Zone in that continuum. Rod Serling was aware of EC Comics. I can tell you that too. So that's what I would say.
Right.
I find it interesting that we're living through this moment, like I was trying to articulate a moment ago, of profound socio-political stressors. And at that same moment is this massive resurgence of like comic book, right, Marvel Universe movies, right? like the zombie genre's resurgence in the last 10 years. And it seems, based on what Michael has sort of shared with us, that that's no accident, right? That's how we talk as a country, how we talk through these periods of stress and uncertainty and anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, on that note, April said, I loved learning how suppression of certain topics led to the genesis of Mad Magazine. I wonder what other examples of creative innovation were inspired by censorship.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what's, irony is one of America's leading exports. So it's just always great to see the sort of the unintentional results, the unintentional consequences that, this repression during the Red Scare, certainly doesn't produce any sort of, plateau of everyone following the rules all the time. I mean, less, 10 years, 12 years out from the peak of the Red Scare, you've got, people running around naked on acid. I mean, I don't think that was the plan during the 1950s. And yet that's what happens. But yeah, I mean, Mad Magazine, read any interview with like the San Francisco psychedelic, rock scene, read any interview with any of those musicians. And there's at least two people in the band who are going to name drop Mad Magazine. All the late 60s, early 70s Hollywood filmmakers, that kind of rebel generation of filmmakers, Dennis Hopper and Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, all like either EC comic book fans or Mad Magazine fans. So it's pretty remarkable how influential the EC comics of, I mean, again, 4.5 years, just 1950 through 1954. But huge influence on, it's almost like every 10-year-old kid. There's that old joke that like the Velvet Underground was not that popular of a band, but like every single person who bought a Velvet Underground record then went and started a band. And I kind of feel like almost every single person who read an EC comic book started a band or made comics or became just immersed in the counterculture of the late 60s and early 70s. And even the New York City punk scene of the mid to late 70s, they loved Mad. I mean, the earliest zines, the punk magazine of the Lower East Side of New York, John Holstrom, the guy who did that, was like a fanatic EC and Mad Magazine fan and like imitated the Ramones loved the Twilight Zone, Mad Magazine, and EC comic books. I mean, there is definitely a continuum that comes out of these comic books in the early 1950s. And then there was a question in the chat. Somebody was like, $8.95? Weird Science cost? No, the reprint that I bought a few years ago cost the originals, of course, sold for like 10 cents, 10 or 15, I think 10 cents was the standard cover price. Even dog-eared beat up copies of EC comics are a couple $100 these days. So if you ever see one at a garage sale, grab it.
All right. I think this might be our last comment or question. It is a little bit long. And speaking of Hollywood, it says, I loved this book so much. Felt like I should have known more about all of this. And this talk expanded all of that feeling further whilst allowing that goal to happen. Smiley face. One question I have is how in the book the author made it seem as if Kirk Douglas was responsible by his actions in ending much of the blacklisting. Is this true? How does this intersect with what you shared? And thank you so much, everyone.
All men are Spartacus, right? I'm Spartacus. Nick is Spartacus. The Rat Pack is Spartacus. Everyone's Spartacus. That's the whole Kirk Douglas thing, right? Because Spartacus is the big slave rebellion movie. And I know some people like to mark that. And also that it was the blacklisted screenwriter. I mean, that's certainly part of it. I think, Nick, you pointed out, well, there's some legal decisions that explain why the federal government loses its enthusiasm for locking up communists. And I think, maybe also the thing to point out is that liberal Democrats really absorb this kind of anti-communist stance. I mean, I think of John F. Kennedy, who, basically argued that the Eisenhower administration had sort of dropped the ball on keeping up with the Soviets in terms of technology and winning allies in Asia and Africa. And like, let's spend less time figuring out if your postal carrier is a communist, and let's spend more time winning hearts and minds in, decolonized Africa and Asia. But I will now defer to Nick on his take on that question.
It's a great question. And I can't speak to the specifics of Kirk Douglas, but what I can speak to is the timing of the shift, right? Like the moment when it was like the Red Scare, if Red Scare was a balloon, the moment the balloon popped. And that was the 1954 midterm congressional elections.
Yeah.
Because it was building to that moment was the height of McCarthy being demagogue number one and sucking all the air out of the room. And in the midterm elections in 1954, Republicans lose the Senate majority. And what that meant is he could no longer chair the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, which meant he lost his platform. And the Senate denounced him, right, in a formal resolution after the election results were in, but before the Democrats had taken over the Senate, before the new class of senators had been sworn in, meaning that in a technical sense, the Republicans still had the majority in the Senate, but it was time, like the writing was on the wall because of the election results, that the Republican Party needed to change course, at least, right, in some respects.
What a charming time where people look at the result of an election and are like, oh, I guess we should change what we're doing because the people is. What a charming time in American history. Who knew? Who knew these things? Yeah. Awesome.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom, knowledge on this, and your entertainment with us. This has been fabulous. And I know, Denise, you're going to come back on for a minute or two to say goodbye.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to both of you. It was very entertaining and interesting and enlightening and all those things. Just as an aside, we're going to be talking about Kirk Douglas a little bit on Thursday because he likes to take credit for getting Dalton Trumbo credited for his work on Spartacus. So that was a good segue into that. So hopefully people in the audience will join us on Thursday. And thank you, Sarah, for your expertise in making things run smoothly as always. And to all of the people who attended tonight, thank you so very much. And we hope to see you again.
Yeah. Thank you.
And there's a beautiful moon out there too.
Oh, and Michael and Nicholas, you should look at the Q&A. You have lots of people saying thank you. And you're the best instructors in Cabrillo. And I have not taken a class from you, but I would certainly agree.
Come on in. Happy to have anybody. You just say, just drop the friends of the line, just drop the Art Community Reads, and I'll get you in to a class that's full. I'll sneak you in. So yeah,
now
you can offer that tonight. Yeah.
That's all right.
That's a special for library fans. We'll get you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Hey, thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.